Um,
Okay.
well, first of all, it's lovely to see everyone. And Simon, thank you very much for
This
joining.
is so damn exciting.
So I've known Simon, I think, since, well, sometime just after 1978 or 79. Simon and my mother were in a hotel in Jodhpur. Apparently the Maharaja had just opened his palace and turned it into a hotel. I think it was a 600-room hotel. And there were 3 people staying there, apparently, according to my mother. So Simon, my mother, and according to my mother, a fascist. I don't know if that was his kind of official designation or if it's someone just my mum called a fascist, but Simon will remember. Simon was living at the time in India. He was a correspondent from The Guardian. And over the years, we would see Simon, Simon, you'd come and visit us in London. We had a guest room and we had a visitor's book, and Simon would come a few times a year, I think. And over the years, we've met up either in Belsize Park or here in New York. Simon, when did you move to America?
Well, I was a correspondent here from 72 to 76, so before I met your mum. And then I came back from 79 to 81. And then I went off to Hong Kong for quite a long time and came back to America after the British left Hong Kong in 1997, and have been there ever since, and became a citizen in 2011. And then Trump got elected and I began to wonder if it was entirely the wrong thing. But anyway, I was able to exercise my vote. So
you are officially an American now.
Yep.
And
so we would as well.
I remember actually one encounter in Oxford. My mother and I were coming to visit with a cousin of mine who was an Orthodox Jew. And I think just before we set off, Pip called you to let you know we were coming for lunch. And the last minute piece of information was that she would only eat kosher. And between us leaving Belsize Park and arriving at your place in Oxford, you had actually become an expert in kashrut, because you knew more about it certainly than I did, and I think possibly more than my mum did. But I always remembered being very impressed by, and this was kind of pre-internet days, that you would find you were very kind of inquisitive, and you took it upon yourself to find out. So this was kind of your time as a journalist. And you've since written kind of numerous books. I think the first book of yours that I was aware of, I think had some heraldic crests on the cover. And I think it was his noble lordships. Is that right?
Yeah.
So you've come quite a long way since then. So just to let everyone know, Simon's going to speak to us for an hour or so, I think, and then have some questions. But I think you said that you're quite happy for people to ask questions as we go along, or to make comments as we go along.
Of course. If I have a capacity for being staggeringly boring. So if I become boring, do tell me to move to something else. So some of you, notably you and your mum, have heard this story before, so you can play among yourselves. But I can also hear myself through someone's speaker. I'm not sure why that's happening. But,
we should all mute.
Go on mute.
We should all mute unless we want to speak.
Very good idea. All right. Well, I'll tell you the rather bizarre story of how I got into this business in the first place. I was a geologist and I studied geology at university, and went off. I wasn't a very good geologist, and went off to Uganda in 1966, the summer of '66, and I was working for a Canadian mining company, looking for copper in the northern slopes of the Ruwenzori Mountains, which I'm sure many of you will know is the source of the Blue Nile, I think, rather than the White Nile. Anyway, these mountains are very spectacular, and they're on effectively the border between Congo and Uganda. Beautiful, beautiful countryside. And I was living in a tent with 25 Ugandans who were ostensibly working for me, cooking and helping me do the survey and so forth. And I was like a little sort of imperial king emperor. It was an extraordinary, I was what, it was 67, I was 21, so a youngster. So there was a library at a place called Fort Portal, about 40 miles away, a British Council library, part of the sort of, the spreading British culture abroad. And I was at the time, because I was on the slopes of these mountains, pretty obsessed with mountaineering. So I used to get from the library any books I could on epic expeditions. And that was the time when they were climbing the north face of the Eiger and Dhaulagiri and peaks like that. And then there was one book that I came across called Coronation Everest by a man called James Morris. And I'm glad you're muted, because some of you may already have anticipated the end of this story and you mustn't shout it out, so please don't. So James Morris, Coronation Everest. He was the London Times correspondent on the expedition which got to the summit of Mount Everest on the 31st of May, 1953. And it's really a story of two things. Him as a mountaineer, and he lived in North Wales. He's never been on a mountain greater than a couple of thousand feet. And he got up to something like 26,000 feet on the top of this beast. So he courageous mountaineering exploits, but also the cunning and deviousness and intense competition, which allowed him to get the news of the success of Hillary and Tenzing back to London, a very elaborate system of codes and telegraph runners, people with cloven sticks and things, to get the news back to London such that it could be published in the Times on the morning of the Queen's coronation, our present Queen, 2nd of June, 1953. And I remember as a small boy, I was, what, 8, waking up to what for me at the time was a glorious day, the coronation of the Queen, and also that a British expedition in a sort of last imperial hurrah had managed to get to the top of the world's highest mountain. So I read this book completely enthralled, and I thought to myself, it was a Pauline or a Damascene conversion. I'm not a very good geologist, but by gosh, I would love to wander around the world with a pencil and notebook and become a journalist. So I wrote to this fellow, I'd never heard of James Morris before, care of his publishers, Faber and Faber, Queen Square, London, WC1. Dear Mr. Morris, I'm a 21-year-old geologist living in East Africa, and I've just read your utterly enthralling book, By the Campfire Overnight. And bottom line, can I be you? And you would have thought he would have just dismissed this as yet another, but he wrote back. And oddly enough, there's a coda to this story, which I'm going to tell you right at the beginning. I found the letter the other day. This is a letter from where he lived, Trefn Hall, Clonystumdwy, Cricketh in Wales, dated the 7th of September, 1966. Dear Mr. Winchester, many thanks for your letter. I'm so glad you like the book. Giving me advice on how to become a writer, in which he quite candidly said it's impossible to give you advice, but if you don't aim higher than my own level of craftsmanship, he said, then journalism might offer you opportunities both of gathering material and of practicing the craft, besides being great fun. So I thought, yes, why don't I try and become a journalist? So that he said in this letter, if you really want to do that, on the day you receive this, not next week, not next month, not next year, the day you receive it, give up your job in East Africa, stop being a geologist, come back to England, try and get a job on a local newspaper and write to me again. Well, I went into the office, which was 20 miles away from my camp, and I said, I'm resigning. I've never seen happier people in my life. They said, a limousine to take you to Entebbe Airport. Be quiet. The dog obviously likes this part of the story. And I was on a BOAC flight from Entebbe to London that night and arrived mid-September, rainy, cold, nowhere really to live, and with no job. But the feeling that journalism was probably for me. So I managed to wangle, because of a contact I'd had when I lived in Oklahoma a few years previously, a temporary job on an oil rig in the North Sea. And from the oil rig would send letters to every newspaper that I could imagine. And after about 6 months, a paper in Newcastle upon Tyne in the very north of England, industrial city, coal mines, shipbuilding, that sort of thing, said, okay, you can come and be a reporter here. Whereupon I wrote to James again, and by this time I'd read most of the books that he had written. A book on Oxford, where I'd been at university, a book on Venice, classic book on Venice, book on Spain. I mean, I had no idea, but he was really a heavy hitter of a travel writer. So I wrote to him and I said, and here is the reply, now 2 pages instead of 1, saying, this was a year later, September 1967. I'm so glad that you've arrived in Newcastle, just the right place, I should think, telling me about his time in Bristol and giving me 3 pieces of advice. 1, and it sounds a bit sappy today, but I absorbed it totally. Never lose, he said, your sense of wonder, because as a journalist, you'll see extraordinary things, you'll go to amazing places and meet remarkable people. Don't become jaded and blasé about them. It's wonderful. You've got an extraordinary opportunity. Don't bother to learn shorthand, he said, complete waste of time. They will tell you at your newspaper you've got to have a 120 words Pitman, but don't bother. And number 3, every month or so, send me all the clippings, stories you've written for this newspaper, send them to me in North Wales, where I live, and I'll annotate them and send them back to you and try and turn you into a halfway decent writer. Well, I did. I mean, you can imagine the stories that I was writing in those early days, you know, 2 nuns in car crash, none hurt, that sort of thing. Or pigeon fancier loses prize bird. So I would send these stories, which over the years would get bigger and more substantial, down to North Wales, and back they would come. This sentence a little leaden, this verb a little infelicitously chosen, whatever. And slowly, under his tutelage, the writing got better. So after about 2.5 years, another letter, I won't bore you by showing the letters, which of course I've kept sedulously. He said, if I were you, I would now try and get a job on The Guardian, which he used to work for. And so I tried, and indeed was lucky enough to be accepted to a job where I remained in Newcastle, but was responsible for covering all of Northeast England. So Cumberland, Westmoreland, Northumberland, Durham, right up to the Scottish border, a huge tract of territory and fascinating people. And I remember vividly a sort of life-changing moment that I had interviewed the then Prime Minister, who was Harold Wilson. And I thought, here are geologists come a long way interviewing the British Prime Minister. And I called the news desk to which I was going to dictate my story. And they said, oh, don't worry about that. You've got to go to Belfast today because our correspondent in Belfast has got flu and there's a weekend of possible trouble.
Your screen just froze, Simon.
Simon, can you hear me? Because your screen has frozen.
Talk among yourselves.
Yeah, he just disappeared from the skull. There he's back, just back, but I don't hear anything.
Did I lose you? Don't tell me an hour ago.
Simon, you had just been called to
Belfast.
Belfast, and then
Well,
you.
yeah, okay. So I went to Belfast and stayed there for the next 3 years and saw all the sort of major events of the beginning of the Troubles. And every month was sending all my stories over to James in North Wales and getting them back. Then after that, surviving those 3 years, the paper then said, would you like to go to Washington? So absolutely. So the career was really burgeoning, if you like. So I flew to Washington right at the beginning of Watergate. So the story for the next couple of years was essentially Watergate, followed by the resignation of Nixon. And I was in the White House on the day he resigned, watched him fly off on Marine One. And then in September, when President Ford, if you remember, pardoned Richard Nixon, I suppose I should have been in Washington, but in fact I was in Idaho covering the failed attempt by Evel Knievel to jump the Snake River Canyon. So that was a bit of a bish as far as the paper was concerned, but I was told Washington is eventually quiet now because you've got the Watergate scandal is over, Nixon has been pardoned, go on holiday. So I arranged with a young woman I knew a climber back in London called Jackie Leishman, a reporter on the paper who was a climber. We'd meet in London. So I flew to London with the view of going climbing in North Wales. And so picked up the rental car, drove up the M6 or whatever it is. And on the way up, Jackie said, doesn't your friend James Morris live in North Wales? And I said, you're absolutely right, he does. Well, we must make contact. And I said, well, I've never spoken. It's all being conducted by letter. She said, this is ridiculous. You've got to speak to him. He'd love to hear from you. So we got to our hotel in Llanberis, a place called the Penny-Gyrraid Hotel. And Jackie looked up Morris J. Llanystumdwy in the phone book, and there he was. And so we dialed the number. I was terrified. Put the phone to my ear, and the voice said hello. And I said, this is Simon Winchester. And this person said, really, this is amazing. Are you calling from Washington? I read you every day. And I said, no, I'm I'm in the Penny-Gyrraid Hotel, just 2 miles away from where you live. Well, he said, you've got to come for tea. So the next day, Jackie and I went climbing, came down from the hills at about 3, drove to this little village called Llanystumdwy, and found this house, a lovely Georgian house, parked the car, and I'm telling you it in details because it was in a moment that sort of seared into my memory, walked across the gravel to the front door, which had glass panels on either side through which you could see parquet flooring and nice oriental rugs and things. And we were filthy dirty, our boots were, because we'd been climbing about all day. So I rang the doorbell and we both knelt down on the front doorstep to undo our boots. And the door opened and a woman appeared. And I said, oh, hello, you must be, I'm Simon, this is Jackie, you must be Mrs. Morris. And this person said, no, I'm James, actually. There was a bit of a sort of drawing in of breath. And I stood up and I said, because the hair was very long, I said, I'm so sorry, I mean, one can never tell these days. And this person said, I'll get my wife. And so I imagined that this was some weird joke, and down the stairs would come a middle-aged lady, but not, well, in fact, middle-aged, no, I thought a man would come down with a beard and a Yukon Jack shirt or something. But in fact, down the stairs came a middle-aged lady with a little girl in tow. And we all troop into the drawing room to have tea with me, fairly obviously a man, and Jackie, fairly obviously a young woman, and Elizabeth Morris, middle-aged lady, Suki, little 9-year-old girl, and my hero, who I've been writing to now for the previous decade, twin set and pearls, little hanky stuffed into her sleeve, pencil skirt, legs decorously crossed, little court shoes, and the accoutrements, I mean, very substantial accoutrements, if I can put it like that, of womanhood. But being Britain, nothing was said about this. We just drank our tea and ate our rich tea biscuits and things until about 6:30, when it was suggested we might leave. So we left and went back to the hotel. And on the way, Jackie said, what the? And I said, I have no idea, not the foggiest. So we were puzzled and amazed, and then got back to the hotel. And the following morning, a letter was slid under my door. And I opened it up, and it was from this person. Dear Simon, I'm sorry to have put you through a somewhat awkward social situation last night, but the fact of the matter is that I decided to become a woman, and I'm going to Casablanca next week. That's where the surgery was performed in those days. And if everything goes according to plan, I will return here in about a month, and as a woman, and I'm taking the name Jan Morris, and I hope you can accept that. And I hope we'll be friends, and we've remained friends ever since. In fact, we wrote a book together about the last remaining buildings of the Raj in India, Pakistan, you know, post offices and palaces and everything, the architectural legacy of empire in South Asia. And we saw each other several times a year. And the coda that I was just going to mention to this is that this little tin box here, which has these letters in, I found last December. It was languishing somewhere in an attic here. And I found it and fell upon these letters, which I hadn't seen for half a century. And I rang Jan in Wales to say, you'll be amazed, the letters that changed my life from you, Jan, I've just found them. And her phone didn't answer. And I called her the next day at 10 my time, which would have been 3 her time, tea time, then again at 5 her time, and then at dinner time. And she didn't answer at all. And then the next morning, which was Friday, one of my children rang to tell me that Jan had died. So I was never able to tell her, but she knew that she had utterly changed my life. So that's how it all began. And I am consequently happy to talk about things that then befell me during a career which unwound from essentially 1966 onward. So, Alexandra, I don't mean to put you on the on notice, but any particular area that you would find interesting? I mean, we talked idly about prison this morning. Should I talk about that event?
I think that would be great. I did just want to ask a question about how, apart from influencing your decision to become a writer or a journalist, what would you say the main impact of James and Jan was on your career? I mean, how you were sending clippings to her, and she, I mean, was it through the advice she gave you, or was it through other issues around direction? Was it to do with traveling? Because obviously you're a geologist and you've traveled the world, and I think you're a member of the Royal Order of it's a travelers club where you've traveled to more than, I think, 100 countries. Is that right?
Something like that, yes. I mean, travel had a lot to do with it, but I think her literary style, in a way, was what I found most attractive. And now we've revealed who it is. I dare say many in the audience will have read some of Jan's books. I mean, the Venice book remains a classic, and her 3-volume History of the British Empire, the Pax Britannica trilogy, as it's called, it's just so done with such a deft, light touch. And she loved footnotes, which I adore. I mean, particularly if they're witty, as hers often manage to be. So I think it's a combination of the kind of curiosity she displayed about the world beyond, a fondness for history, a deft literary style, and the use of footnotes, plus the kind of subjects she was interested in. I am, and I know I have to temper my remarks, particularly when I go back to England, but I am a great fan of the British Empire. I mean, I can feel myself being ordered to wash my mouth out as I say so. But yes, empires are obviously a bad thing, whether it's the Mughals or the Venetians or the Ottomans or the Romans or whoever. We're bad. For one country to claim suzerainty over another is entirely wrong. But given that, the people that fanned out across the empire, a lot of them sort of blameless, dull civil servants who were fascinated with the countries that they landed up in, did a lot of good and left particularly a literary legacy. I mean, look at people like Arthur Grimble, A Pattern of Islands, one of the best books about the South Pacific Islands. But I could go on. But Jan, I think, gave me that combination of curiosity and lightness of touch. None of these things could I ever aspire to. I mean, she was brilliant and I'm at her feet, but she guided me in that sense.
Mm, mm. Well, I think moving forward, I think it would be, what's kind of interesting to me is that you kind of started off as a geologist and the way in which that has actually featured in many of your books. But there's also this kind of sense of curiosity and adventure. So I think it would be interesting to hear about your times in the Falklands, for example, in Tierra del Fuego.
Let me just go slightly to one side, if I may. The book that I suppose, if I can put it as blatantly, as self-servingly as this, was called The Professor and the Madman, which was written in 1998, a long time ago now, but it's still happily in print. It's just been made into one of the worst films ever made by humankind, starring, it should have done a lot better, Sean Penn and Mel Gibson, but it's a bad film for a variety of reasons, nothing to do with the script or the people who made it. But having written that book, my then editor, legendary fellow called Larry Ashmead, now sadly dead, he was the one that discovered this book and said, you've got to write it as a book. We analyzed why it had been successful, because who would have thought that a book about 19th century lexicography, and this is a book about the making of the Oxford English Dictionary and the involvement in that process of an American murderer locked up in an insane asylum in west of London. Why would that ever have been popular? And it sold millions. Totally surprising to me and to HarperCollins too. And Larry said, well, we think it's because of 4 features. One, you're writing about an ordinary but forgotten man who did something remarkable that changed human history. And the ups and downs of his life, the trajectory of his life, was so astonishingly roller coaster-like. And I should say parenthetically that for those of you that haven't read the book or have forgotten it, in a fit of rage at himself inside his cell in the asylum, he, in 1902, I think it was, cut off his penis and threw it in the fire because he believed this was the seat of all his problems. That led Larry to say, added to all these things, ordinary man, major contribution, trajectory, and also grotesque bodily mutilation. Can we, said Larry, find somebody else that fit those 4 criteria? And I said to Larry, I don't know who you think I hang out with, but no, I don't think I can. But then I went home and remembered that back when I lived in Washington during the Watergate years, the woman that babysat for my children was of a family called Greeley. And her grandfather, who was called Adolphus Washington Greeley, led a very ill-fated expedition to the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, in the 1870s, in which of the 25, only 6, including him, survived. And there were stories of cannibalism and all sorts of things. So that story was a remarkable story of heroism. Unknown person made a major contribution, which I won't go into now, in human to science anyway. And trajectory of his life's up and down because he was branded as a hero and then as a cannibal. And he did wonderful things after coming back from his expedition. And if you believe the cannibalism, then elements of grotesque bodily mutilation. So I was all set to do this book. And I went down to the National Archives in Washington to find that somebody else, a man, 75-year-old gentleman living in Richmond, Virginia, was taking out the same files from the library as I was. And I suspected, therefore, he was writing a book too. So I rang him. And he said, yeah, I've been working on the Greeley story for the last 25 years. And it seems sort of rude, sort of typical British journalist behavior, one might say, to elbow this chap out of the way. And I said, okay, don't worry, I won't do it. So I went back to Larry and said, I think I need another subject. And he said, well, that's all right. These things happen. So weren't you once a geologist? Can you think of anyone from geology that met those criteria? So I sort of remembered my tutor at Oxford, a chap called Harold Redding, did a course on the history of geology, on early geologists. And I remember, stuck in my mind for some reason, a chap called William Smith, who created the first ever geological map of anywhere. And I looked him up, and there was a tiny reference in Britannica, which was used in those days, saying Smith William, born Churchill, Oxfordshire, 1769, died Scarborough, Yorkshire, 1832, creator of the first ever geological map in the world. And then there were 5 sentences that really whetted my appetite. One, his map was plagiarized. 2, he went bankrupt. 3, he went to debtor's prison. 4, his wife went mad. 5, she became a nymphomaniac. And seeing that word nymphomaniac, and this was just coming off the end of, you remember that fellow that cut off, the woman that cut off her husband's member in
Sorry,
Rage. I thought,
Hobbit.
But yes,
so yeah, glad you remember. So so I thought this could fly. So I went back to Larry and he said, terrific. And he these are the days when you use Tipex or whatever it's called, whiteout, whited out the name really and wrote in Smith. And it was off to the races. And so I wrote this book about William Smith, dedicating it in the end to this my tutor, Harold Redding. And the book duly came out, and I think hard on the heels of The Professor, which was still selling, did pretty well. I remember sending it to my tutor. And I'd got, at least I used to think I'd got a degree at Oxford known as a Desmond. A Desmond is a play on Desmond Tutu. So it was a 2-2 second class degree, second tier of that class. Turns out I actually got a 2-1, so it wasn't all that bad and the joke doesn't work. But Harold Redding would have been the one that awarded me the degree. So I sent him this book. He'd never had a book dedicated to him. He read it and he said, "Dear Winchester, I'm honored to have a book dedicated to me, and I've read it in detail. And I'd just like to say, because of course we were all disappointed you left the trade and went off to become a journalist, that had you submitted this for your degree dissertation back in 1966, I would have considered awarding you a rather better degree than the one I gave you at the time." So in a way, I sort of felt vindicated. So that started me off on 3 geology books: The Map That Changed the World, then Krakatoa, which was this extraordinary world-shaking eruption in 1883. The important thing about Krakatoa is, it's in Indonesia between Java and Sumatra, is that it coincided with the building, the completion, if you like, of the world's first submarine cable. So it's worth remembering that when Lincoln was assassinated, it took 12 days for that news to reach London, because it was taken by telegraph up to Nova Scotia and then put on a boat to Cornwall, South Wales or somewhere, and then get to London. But on this occasion, the cable had just been completed. And so there was this signal. There was a cable station just by where Krakatoa erupted at a village which is still there today called Anya. And the cable operator typed a note saying, "Massive eruption, many dead, expect I'll be something." I think dot, dot, dot. He transmitted it, and it went from Anya to Batavia, which is now Jakarta, and then from Jakarta under the sea, this was the crucial thing, to Singapore, and then under the sea to Colombo and Sri Lanka, what is now Sri Lanka, and then Salon, Colombo to Bombay, Bombay to Aden, which was a British colony in the Gulf of Arabia, and then up through Suez to Port Said, then to Cyprus, then to Malta, then to Gibraltar, into the Atlantic to Biarritz, up to Cherbourg or somewhere, across the English Channel to Falmouth, up to London, where it arrived 4 minutes after the eruption. So all of a sudden, people that were going to work in London the next morning were talking in sort of familiar terms of places like Java and Sumatra, Krakatoa, the Strait, whatever it's called, Stuva, all of these words which previously they'd only managed to be talking about, Whitehall and Chichester and Dorset. All of a sudden, the world seemed to have shrunk. And it was the beginning, I know it sounds a bit of a cliche, the beginning of the global village. So although Krakatoa is very interesting geologically, socially, it changed everything, because all of a sudden news, not quite as instantaneous as today, but getting there. And then the third book in this sort of trilogy, published as a trilogy, was about the San Francisco earthquake. It was the 100th anniversary. and that would have been on the 18th of April, 2006. And then after that, I began to get a bit too big for my boots, I suppose, and started writing books on much bigger topics: the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the building of America, the knitting together of America, the history of precision engineering, because my father was one, and most recently, the history of the ownership of land. And the next book, the book I'm working on, you'd think would be an impossible topic. But the secret, I think, well, I don't know that I've cracked the secret, but what I try to do anyway is to corral everything into manageable packages and make it, I don't much like the word accessible, but anyway, what I'm working on now is the history of the dissemination of knowledge. The idea being that with knowledge so easily on tap, just Google it, we don't keep it in, much as we did anyway, within our brains. And if you accept that wisdom is knowledge multiplied by experience, then a lack of knowledge could ultimately result in a lack of wisdom in society, which I think would be a bad thing. So it's looking about how knowledge is disseminated, how children learn, when they learn, whether there are common things that all children all over the world do know or should know. And then looking at broadcasting and encyclopedias and the whole question of polymaths, whether it's possible still for there to be polymaths. And then where do we go from here? Artificial intelligence and that sort of thing. So very interesting topic. But bring this, I'm sorry, you want to say something, Alexander?
I just wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the advice given or the analysis from your editor, HarperCollins. Dismemberment aside, or kind of throwing penises into bins aside, the idea of kind of personalizing, bringing in the human stories and the human drama, was that something that you kept through all the subsequent books, just trying to kind of, because you bring in very large ideas and very large stories, but you want to make them personally relatable. So was that a big part of your kind of writing method, to tell kind of individual stories throughout? I mean, I haven't read Land yet, but did that feature in that book?
The prologue of Land is all about 102 acres that I bought in Dutchess County, New York, when I returned from Hong Kong, which became sort of symbolically important to me because once I'd become an American citizen, I felt truly, properly invested in the country. I owned a bit of it, but then thought, well, wait a minute, what does ownership actually mean? And I went through all the titles. And my title was obviously printed, and the previous titles were printed until the 19th century, and then they were handwritten in rather elegant copperplate. And then you got into the 18th and 17th centuries, and they weren't written in English anymore, they were written in Dutch. And the person from whom the land was being transferred was no longer able or willing to write a signature, but would draw a little picture of a deer or just write an X. And you realize that the first, quote, owners were Mohican Native Americans, and that they had never had the same concept of ownership we do today. Their clans, if you like, their families superintended it. And to use an Australian term, the Aboriginal Australians say, the earth is our mother, and we can't own our mother looks after it, we look after her. So I was looking at the history of ownership from when it sort of formally began in England in 1604 with the first formal Enclosures Act in Radipole in Dorset, and then looking to how that transfers itself to the United States and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, and how it has evolved here with people, I mean, fascinated, for instance, by the law of trespass, and comparing the idea that here you have an absolute right to exclude people from your land, whereas in, let's say, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, there is a concept called allemansratten, where everyone is allowed on any land, no matter to whom it may be, who owns it, so long as you behave properly. And that seems a much more civilized way to look at land than to surround it by barbed wire and motion detectors and security cameras, as is regrettably so often the case in this country. So yeah, so I'm not quite sure what the question was, but yes, the subjects get bigger and bigger. But I should perhaps tell you a bit about the whole prison business. Let me see, and it brings me back in a way to you and your mum, because it was to do with India, and I was in Simla, or Shimla as it's now called, which is up in the lower flanks of the Himalayas. It's where the British Raj would decamp in the hot months because it was cooler, and rule India from there. And now it's sort of a rather lovely place, but and it is cool, but full of large, generally wooden structures made of deodar wood usually, which is highly flammable, and with electrical wiring still put in by the British in the 1930s and 40s. And so short circuits and fires, and the similar fire brigade is just a couple of Land Rovers with a couple of buckets of sand in the back. So the Sunday Times sent me to do a piece on the fate of Simla's architectural legacy. Will it all burn down? So I was up there beavering away with a photographer, having a rare old time, when I got a telegram. This was back in the days when one got telegrams, saying, Veritas, return to London immediately. It was signed McChrystal, Cal McChrystal, who was the foreign editor of the paper. So I thought, oh my gosh, it's a problem with my expenses, which were always great works of fiction, like any foreign correspondents always were. So I drove like the wind down to Delhi and managed to squeak onto that night's British Airways flight back to London, and presented myself, weary, to Cal in his office. He said, oh yes, nice for you to come. And I said, I'm sorry, I've got some expenses received. No, it had nothing to do with your expenses. We think there's a bit of bother in the South Atlantic. Without going too much into detail, there was an island associated with the Falkland Islands called South Georgia. And a bunch of Argentine scrap metal merchants had arrived there with a view to dismantling an old whaling station that the British had built in the 1920s. And the crucial thing was they hadn't got permission to do so because it's British territory. And they had said, no, it's not, it's ours. So we got a bit cross with them, and we had a destroyer down on patrol in the South Atlantic, HMS Glasgow, I think it was. And they said, okay, so we whistled that up, and there were some fierce looking men on board. And they similarly sent one of their destroyers, which oddly enough, we, the British, had sold to them about 10 years before, same class as HMS Glasgow. And they were sort of pointed bow to bow at each other, one defending the interests of Argentinian sovereignty, and the other defending the interests of British sovereignty, alleged British sovereignty. So this was the tense situation that I was asked to go. So I was terrific. I always had a bag packed for moments like this, and so I flew to Madrid that afternoon and booked that night Sarah Lineas Argentina's flight to BA, Buenos Aires. And I had one friend there, a man called Mark Heathcote, who I knew was a spy, a British spy. He and I got to school together, and he worked at the British Embassy in BA as an education attaché. So I rang him up and I said, would you like to come for lunch? And so we had lunch in Claridge's Hotel. Believe me, there is Claridge's in Buenos Aires. And I said, basically, the bottom line is the paper has sent me here because they think there's going to be an invasion of the Falkland Islands, that this situation in South Georgia is going to escalate. And is there? And he said, well, I can never believe that. But I'll tell you this, there is a weekly flight from, oddly enough, an airfield in southern Argentina, a place called Comodoro Rivadavia, to Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, run, oddly enough, by the Argentine Air Force, operates every Tuesday. If you can get on that flight, which you probably will, you'll get to the Falkland Islands, but you may not find it so easy to get back. And this, a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. So I said, fine. Well, he obviously thinks it is going to be invaded. So I got down to Comodoro, got a seat on the plane to Port Stanley. Then a little weird thing happened. There were lots of Royal Marines, because it's the moment you land in Port Stanley, maybe some of you have been down there on cruise ships, it is so British, you wouldn't believe it. And there were British Royal Marines there. One of them, as I was tripping down the stairs of this little aeroplane, he looked at me and he said, "I don't believe it." He said, "Is it Simon?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you may not remember me, but I will never forget you. My name is called Gary Newt." And he was an officer, I think, lieutenant. And I had done a story about him maybe 3 years before, when he was in charge of a detachment in Belize in Central America. And I had written, there was nothing for our soldiers, our Marines there to do. And so a group of them used to go out into the swamps, hunting manatees, which are these gentle elephantine sort of maritime creatures. And I was pretty appalled by this. And so I wrote a piece for The Guardian, which was headlined "Man's Inhumanity to Manatees." And the result of this was that their officer, Gary Newt, was recalled to London to be given a dressing down, and was told that instead of spending the next part of his career in the lush jungles of around Belmopan, the capital of Belize, he would be sent to the much less congenial climate of the Falkland Islands. And so his nemesis stepped off the plane. And so I thought, oh God, this is going to be difficult. But no, he was very nice. And he said, "Yeah, well, there is a bit of trouble brewing. And the problem is that there are 60 of us here. And if the Argentines do invade, they're sending at least 2,000. So we'll play a pretty good match, but I think we'll come in a close second." Anyway, I made myself acquainted with the governor, who was a nice man called Rex Hunt, who had previously been in, oddly enough, Uganda. So we had some form to talk about. And chit-chat, he couldn't really tell me very much. But about 2 days later, then Thursday, I think, I got a call. I was sitting having a dinner in the Upland Goose Hotel, which only serves lamb at every single meal, because Falkland Islands is basically sheep. And so I was glad to be relieved, because the governor's office said, "Come down here at the double." So I ran down to Government House and found the Marines standing outside, all blacked up with grass in their hair, and clearly something was going on. And there was the governor with a hugely long diplomatic telegram. So read this, and I did. And it basically said, "Signals intelligence suggests that an Argentine naval flotilla is headed your way at what can only be construed as battle speed. And they should arrive in your waters at about 0400 local time. So it looks as if you may be going to be invaded. So best of luck." And signed Harrington, who was the foreign secretary at the time. And the governor said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, I'm just a reporter. Whatever you do, I will report, but this is your moment to up your game, to do something for posterity." So he said, "I've never been in a situation like this." He said, "I do know one thing." He said, "There are 14 Argentine nationals somewhere up in the hills constructing a gas pipeline. Should I arrest them?" And I said, "I wouldn't if I do, because if you do arrest them, I'll have to report that, and the Argentine government back in BA will look upon that as a pretext to invade, to rescue their compatriots." He said, "Yeah, good point. I tell you what," he said, I don't know much about this sort of thing, but when you can think of nothing to do, I think a person in authority like you has one recourse. You can declare a state of emergency." He said, "What a terrific idea." So he got on the radio and declared a state of emergency, which meant nothing. But it did mean that the FIDF, the Falkland Island Defence Force, could be mustered in the local church hall. They didn't have any weapons. They had rifles totally made of wood. And so they marched up and down a bit and made a bit of noise. And so the governor thought, "I've done all I can do." And I was duly trying to report it until about 4:30, when sure enough, people living down the end of the island telephoned in. They had party lines and they dialed in, saying amphibious vehicles are landing from the sea, and troops are pouring out, and there's a bit of gunfire from our chaps. But the force is moving towards the capital, Port Stanley. And sure enough, by about just a little after dawn, Government House came under attack. I was sitting there with the governor and the colonial secretary and Mabel, who was the governor's wife, who just sat there drinking brandy and soda. I mean, she was completely smashed out of her mind, and so calm as anything. And the governor fluttering around, burning files and doing all the things that people are supposed to do. And I was, along with his driver, a man called Don Berry, I think, sheltering under his bed because they raked the place with machine gun fire. And then at about 8:30, attaching a bed sheet to an umbrella, the colonial secretary walked out and surrendered. And all our force was gathered together, now less about 5 who remained behind and went jungly and stayed in the Falklands hidden for the rest of the war. The rest of them were disarmed and made to lie face down in the mud while Argentine soldiers searched them, and all these things happened, like pulling down the Union flag and raising the Argentine bandera to show that Argentina had triumphed over the British imperialists and they now ran the joint. So I then took photographs and of the shame of the British paratroopers being face down in the mud. So I had a little canister of film, and I went back to the Upland Goose and using my Olivetti 32 typewriter, typed out an account of what I had seen and found that all the telex lines were down. It was impossible to communicate. But the Argentine authorities rounded up all the British troops and deported them to Montevideo in Uruguay. And they said they were going to deport the governor and his family, Mabel, who could barely stand, their 16-year-old son, who was on holiday from boarding school in England, the colonial secretary, the driver, and all these people. So I typed out my story feverishly, and the governor said he was going out in style, wearing his swan feathered cap and his sword and all the trappings of a British imperial figure. So I said, would you stuff the story in his long boots? And he said, of course he would. So I went to the airport with him. He was under guard and I was allowed to be free. And I watched him going into the airport and saw him being ordered to undress because they didn't want pictures of a strutting imperial sort of pompadour arriving at the other end. So he had to undress, and as he took off his boots, so there was my story, and the head of Argentine intelligence, the nasty little Irish Argentinian man, took the story and showed it to me and ripped it up. So there was the story gone, but I still had one ace card, and that was the cylinder, the 35mm roll of film. And the governor's son hadn't gone through to be searched. And I said, look, terribly rude question, a rather personal question, but do you wear boxers or briefs? And he said, well, since you asked, I wear briefs. And I said, great. Can you snuggle this cylinder where the sun doesn't shine and see if you can get through security? And so he did, and they didn't make him take off his underwear. And he flew to Montevideo, and on arrival handed over this somewhat aromatic canister of film to the Reuters correspondent. And she developed it, and the pictures of our boys being searched by Argentinian invaders was sent to London, and it was all over the front pages the next day. And I've always thought was one of the reasons that so furious did it make Mrs. Thatcher that she said, this shall not stand, I'm going to send a task force. Anyway, I mean, I'm almost at the point, no, not too weary by this, I was deported myself to southern Argentina, where I could then communicate and phone in the story, and then made my way up to Buenos Aires, which was now full of journalists from all over the world, including a friend of mine from the Observer, a chap called Ian Mather, and he and I had been in Beirut about 2 months before. And as we both worked for Sunday papers, we agreed that, and we didn't therefore have a daily copy to file, we would wander about through Argentina to look at the military preparations that were being made for the coming war. And Bahia Blanca, Rivadavia, Rio Gallegos, Rio Grande, and then the most southerly community in the world, Ushuaia in Tierra del Fuego. And in all these places, there were ships being moved and aircraft batteries being installed and so forth. And we were busily sort of snooping around. And I had seen the head of the junta, and And he had said, oh, yes, go anywhere you like. Well, British journalists are our friend, yeah, right. So anyway, I took him at his word and we went everywhere, but were detained in Ushuaia. And they took my film and my notebook, and in it, they found the telephone number of Mark Heathcote, the spy, back in Buenos Aires, the first person I'd seen when I arrived there. And they put two and two together quite reasonably, said Winchester must be a spy as well. Lewis initially to Buenos Aires, be, I thought, deported, but then after 3 days, no, Lewis back, and that was pretty depressing. Rather brutal as well. They painted, in my case, an X with tape on the bulkhead of the aircraft. And if I looked to my left or my right, they would smelt me. And indeed, I did look. I got a right butt in my head, which was very painful. Anyway, we arrived back in BA. We were tried and ultimately sentenced to death for violating, I think it was Article 221B of the Argentine Espionage Act. And there were three of us. There was a photographer as well called Tony Prime. And we were put in a cell in the center of Ushuaia and had a fairly unpleasant time, you know, quite a lot of beating and stuff. And then we, the British, at first, we were losing the war. We lost HMS Sheffield was sunk, HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope. And I thought we might lose the war, but gradually things went in our favor and slowly, the post-imperial moment, the Empire Strikes Back, I remember Newsweek entitled it, "We won the islands back." And so with the war over, we were one of those little details at the loose ends. And so we were freed and under the auspices of the Swiss, were flown back to BA and put up by the Swiss ambassador, and I had my first bath for 3 months in a Swiss bath with soap and all these nice things. And then 3 or 4 days later left to go back to Europe. Only there was a row between the army and the civilian parts of the Argentine government, and the army didn't want to let us go. And there was a furious row between the Swiss ambassador and the soldiers in the airport, and finally we were let onto the plane. And then they wouldn't release the plane. And so we were sitting there in first class seats, A123, I think it was, or row 1, ABC. And not knowing whether we were going to be ordered to be offloaded, but eventually we took off and we were cruising upwards on I think it was an Iberia flight. And we got to about 10,000 feet and the pilot came on and said, this announcement is being made for the benefit of the passengers in ABC 123 to tell you that we've just reached 10,000 feet and we're now over the River Plate in Uruguayan airspace, and you are now free. And our next stop will be Madrid. And the film that night, I've never been able to watch it without tearing up, was Henry and Jane Fonda in On Golden Pond. And when here in New England, the loon calls on the lake, a mile or so behind where I'm sitting now, it strikes a chord in my heart. Anyway, so there we are. Have you all gone to sleep?
Simon, when did you actually stop being a journalist? And kind of, I was just wondering whether, obviously the process is so different from working on a book that will take a number of years. Is there anything about that you miss, about the kind of the adventures of?
Well, I occasionally do, and I do book reviews. And also we started this little newspaper here. And in fact, earlier today, there's a big scandal for this little town erupting over the issue of the town clerk pocketing revenue from the dog licenses. So 7 o'clock this morning, I was writing what will be the lead story in the issue that comes out tomorrow. And some might say, how have the mighty fallen, writing about, but I'm perfectly happy. So I do books and stories about delinquent dog licenses. In the newspaper, bucking the trend nationally has survived now for 11 years and has quite a chunk of money in the bank. So I do a little bit of journalism.
But you feel
I had a feeling listening to you that I was in a Flashman book, you know.
Well, I wouldn't put that too far.
Oh, amazing.
So it's 4:25. I sort of feel, but you're the boss, Alexander. But,
Well, not in Chicago. It's 3:25.
right. But
I'm
should
not
you,
even the boss in my own house. I'm certainly not the boss of the salon. But I was just wondering, does anyone have any questions?
Which of Jan Morris's books, because I know of her, I haven't read them. What should I read?
I think probably the last major book she wrote, which was about Trieste. So it's called Trieste and the Meaning of Nowhere. And this is a fascinating city, which has the most extraordinary history. And she loves it. And she wrote an exquisite book, I guess now about 12 years ago, after which I think it can fairly be said she sort of started to lose the plot a bit. And her books were not as sharp and light as they used to be. So I would say Trieste. Of course, from my point of view, Coronation Everest is the one, because it completely changed.
Well, that I can't wait to read.
But it is remarkable. I have a copy behind me if you can't, I'd be glad to share it with you. And I think you can also get it on Kindle today. It's achieved the status of a classic. And her 3-volume history of the British Empire is very good, really sensationally good.
Did she write about her gender change, her sex change?
Yes, and I honestly, terrible thing to say, but I'm a bit weary. I hope there are no trans people in the audience, simply because I'm a wee bit weary of, despite having, of course, benefited hugely from a person who never really trumpeted the cause of trans people, but was one himself, herself. She had one book called Conundrum, which she wrote, and not surprisingly, a few people were very critical, because she would write about it, at least her immediate sensations, said things which feminists never forgot or forgave. Like, once I had lost all my undercarriage and so forth, I started doing things as only a woman would do, like driving very badly. And I thought, Jan, don't say that. And so there was a bit of a pushback. But that book too has become a bit of a classic, but these days I think would look very dated, considering there is such an ongoing, very lively debate about the whole trans issues today. So it looks a bit out of date.
There's also the book Pleasures of a Tangled Life.
Yes, which is where I've got this, the title of this talk from, and I think Alexander was kind enough to say that I borrowed it from Jan.
I read that about 30 years ago. Still have my copy here somewhere. So it was a pretty...
It is a wonderful life she lived. And I think she left, odd enough, my father-in-law died on Friday, and he left at 95 and just at the right time and in the right situation. So, underlining the point that Jan left when it was right for her to.
Simon,
Definitely.
one of my favorite books ever is not part of this discussion, but did you know Eric Newby?
I did very well, because my father was in prisoner of war camp with him in
Okay,
Flag 7B. Yeah. And if you remember, maybe that's the book that you like.
Short Walk.
And it ends with this marvelous moment with, Alexander was kind enough to point out that I belong to the Travellers Club in London. I'm still paying my dues, but I haven't been there now for 18 months. But one of their sort of deities is the great Arab Wilfrid Thesiger. And there was this lovely moment, more or less at the close of the book, where Eric and his traveling companion, who think of themselves as fairly heroic, going way up Hindu Kush, nonetheless bring with them what in Britain are called lilos, which are inflatable mattresses. And so they're making dinner, and they're in some remote place of yaks and stuff, and they're blowing up their inflatable beds when they hear the unmistakable sounds of hobnail boots on rock somewhere. They think that someone, yeah, this is amazing. Who could it possibly be? They get louder and louder and louder, and they're blowing up their inflatable beds. And sure enough, who hoves to into sight? They've never met him before, but they know who he is. It's Wilfrid Thesiger walking in shorts and with a little rucksack in an utterly remote part of the Hindu Kush, or the Pamir. It's in northern Iran or northern Afghanistan or wherever it is. And he sees them, and you would have thought, you know, Englishman to Englishman, oh, I'd love you to see you. How's the cricket going? That sort of thing. Not at all. He looks with an expression of utter contempt at their blow-up beds and says 2 words only, bloody pansies, before marching on down the mountain. And they're left thinking, I suppose we are really, we ought to sleep on rock.
One of my all-time favorite books.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Did you ever meet Wilfrid Thesiger?
No, I saw him once in the library, but it was such a crush of other members to shake his hand that I never got to meet him, no.
Sounds like a kind of quite a fearsome character.
Oh, Shama.
I was just going to say, I've read bits and parts of Jan Morris's book of Pax Britannica and then Conundrum, and then his trips, her writings on Venice. I think my favorite thing that I read about her, did it say on her tombstone, here are 2 friends at the end of one life? I think their love story is so sublime. It's just lovely. Elizabeth is her sister-in-law. Is that how they identified themselves at the end?
That's how they were, yeah, posited as sisters-in-law, but they then did marry. When, and the pastor or the prelate or whatever you might call him, who performed the remarriage ceremony, came out of retirement at something like 106 years old and performed the ceremony of reunion of these 2. So by the time Jan died, and Elizabeth, I think, is still alive. She certainly was when Jan died, but it's been 6 months since. They were wife and wife, or yes, wife and wife. So yeah, it was a wonderful love story, wonderful. But the real other love of her life, and this is a book that she never wrote, she adored Admiral Jackie Fisher, who's the founder of essentially the modern Royal Navy. He was, if you've never heard of him, he's a remarkable, remarkable character. He was an admiral and a courageous man, and the strange looking sort of simian face, small, top-toe boots. And his big thing, whenever he got onto one of his battleships, because he was the first Sea Lord in charge of a navy, which at the time was the biggest navy in the world, bar none, he would immediately find a young sailor and on the poop deck, the after deck, would dance. He loved to dance. And Jan just thought, when I die and go to wherever God is going to send me, I hope I meet Jackie Fisher and we can be together for the rest of our days.
Mm.
This is kind of Gilbert and Sullivan, you know, origins and inspiration. No wonder those works are so vivid and alive.
They really are. And anyone that doesn't know Jan's writing, and she's not popular anymore, sad to say, she left a book called Allegorizing to be published after her passing, and I guess it'll probably come out this year sometime. But I went to a book signing of hers maybe 3 or 4 years ago at Daunt's, one of the great bookstores in London on Marylebone High Street. 5 people there. I mean, her time as a giantess of travel literature had passed. And I see, I mean, there's a new book out by Colin Thubron, who was a great friend of hers, on the Amur River, which is the river that separates Manchuria from Russia. And that's very much a book. I mean, I was sent the ARC, the advanced reader's copy, only the other day. I dipped into it, and it's clearly a book that owes, as do my much more humble books, their origin to Jan's influence. So that's something to bear in mind, Barbara. Colin Thubron, Thubron, on the Amur River. It'll come out in America, I dare say, later this year.
For this group, she loved Chicago. She was a huge fan of Chicago. I still don't know why. She spoke very highly.
Excuse me.
No. If you read the rest of the city she writes about, it was very funny. I couldn't figure out why she loved Chicago. But what was I going to ask you? Had you met Alexander Chancellor?
Yes, a long time ago in a restaurant in Wallingford in Oxfordshire. He did he start the oldie?
Yes.
Are any of you subscribers? I am over here. I wouldn't venture to say that anyone there looks.
I am a long time subscriber. That's how I know of his writing.
He is completely wonderful. I love the oldie, particularly it's because it's so good humored about growing old. It still has a section each month called "Still Here," people you thought were dead but aren't. Very funny.
Simon, give us the title of your book again, the newest.
The most recent one to come out is called Land:
Okay,
How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. And the one that's coming, well, I'm delivering it in December next year. It's probably going to be called Knowing What We Know.
ooh,
But oddly enough, I have to be on a program tomorrow from Wisconsin Public Radio, talking about it for a program called something about knowing to the best of our knowledge. That's right. So if any of you can tune in to Madison, I'll be on it.
And hopefully you'll come and you'll do your next in-person book tour might take you to Chicago, in which case you might be able to.
Usually does, and
well, if it does, I would love to be hospitable.
been very hospitable today. Thank you.
Well, in person, masked or unmasked.
Well, Simon, thank you very much. It was lovely
I
to.
enjoyed it. You've been a jolly nice audience.
Thank you so much.
No one's
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will leave the meeting now to stop any further embarrassment. Bye-bye.
No, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Oh, wow. I could have listened forever, Alexander.
Absolutely.
I mean, each story was more than the last, and some of the twists and turns from the lovely British understatement to being beaten up in a jail in Argentina. I mean, really? Oh my goodness! Over the Falklands, I had forgotten how much that was a real war. It seemed more, mine's bigger than yours. No, mine's bigger than yours, and that it really was a war. Was astonishing.
Also,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, 'cause
piece
Mark-
on Belfast, in the 60s, early 70s must have been extraordinary. I mean, what a kind of period in history to witness. And then Hong Kong. So I think in a way, kind of being a journalist, you're pushed into situations that you wouldn't necessarily be in as a writer, as a writing book. So I think that took him to a lot of kind of quite dramatic places. And I think also kind of going from writing for a regional paper in the north of England to writing for The Guardian, it must have been quite a kind of turn of events for him too.
What I wanted to ask, but didn't know how to in a way, or it sounded stupid, was how do you research these extraordinarily broad topics of things like the dissemination of knowledge? Really? How do you research that? I mean, this is in Shoma's category of questions that can't be Googled. Google will turn up something, but how does he do that?
How do it know?
How do it know? I mean, this is different from the one about the Oxford Dictionary, which has a focus in a way. This one is going to define the focus, and the same with land. Land, really? How do you get this between two covers?
So Penelope, I think he sort of answered your question when he said, even though he hates the word accessible, he was saying that he starts doing very broad research and starts putting it in smaller packages.
Yeah.
and then it's almost like you start on a really broad trunk road and then you kind of veer off on a side road a little further.
Oh,
Then
what
maybe
I,
have some, making that have integrity and have focus and direction is an incredible achievement. you know.
Oh, yeah.
but
This is-
what I have always found important about this kind of research is that it's not abstract, it's the story of people.
It's concrete. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and people make history, and I have always been utterly bored by abstract history. I want to know what it was like out on the rubber plantations. I want, what were those lives like?
He just rang to say how much he enjoyed talking to you all.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh, nice.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
I
Yeah, I
thought
think,
that the
Barbara,
people
that's right. The writing, I think, he did talk about it, including kind of personalized stories it's really kind of a hook into something that otherwise could seem kind of too abstract and impenetrable.
Exactly. That combined with what the first piece of advice that James, now Jan, told him was never lose your sense of wonder. And I couldn't help but thinking of Shoma's joyful curiosity of the nurse.
Yes,
projects.
yes.
If you never lose your sense of wonder, you can go anywhere. You can just flow with it.
And
it's
I'm
probably-
also convinced there are people, and Simon is one of them, because he is so open to the present and the possibilities that things happen to him and the opportunities appear. I mean, another person wouldn't have had any of that, two nuns in a car crash, none hurt. I mean,
On that point, Barbara, when he was a full-time journalist, many of the assignments he was sent to because of the way he approaches his assignments. Other reporters in the same paper wouldn't have been sent to some of the really hot areas that he went to.
they'd have been in the bars of the hotels. And
Well,
it
he
was
probably did a little of that too.
No, but I mean, there were reporters during Vietnam who were famous for receiving briefings from our intelligence officers, but never ventured into the field. And the ones who nailed it were out with our troops.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, he's definitely kind of had a spirit of adventure throughout his life. So I do kind of wonder whether being kind of like the English public school boy or the English private school boy, whether that kind of opened a lot of doors for him, or whether it had the opposite effect. But I have a feeling, because he's obviously kind of very quick-witted, and he can think on his feet. And
There's a wonderful movie called The Wilpers Times, World War I, and several public school boys start doing reports, satirical. The Army, of course, hates this because it's true what they're reporting. And I'll send you a reference. It's one of those. Simon reminded me of the officer who puts this together. And it has the wit and the charm and the drop dead focus on what's really behind the story.
All right, well, I have to go out now with
You also. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
so much
Wow.
for organizing this, Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
this.
you. Wonderful.
Alexander.
Thank you for inviting me, Barbara.
We missed you.
Nice seeing you, Pip. When we can travel, I can't wait to be in your kitchen again.
Me too. I really look forward to it.
Marvelous.
Bye, everyone.
Ciao.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Ciao, Tutti.